climate change, political division, uncertainty around the future, post-COVID, social media. None of those things, I didn't worry about those things when I was 15 years old. Depressed, I used to work at Bellevue Hospital. Let me show you what depression looks like.
I'm still a lot more worried about under-identification
Uh-huh.
of health problems than I am about over. Anxiety is a great gift to humanity. It serves incredible purposes. All organisms, not just human beings, not just primates, not just mammals, but really all organisms have some capacity for identifying this is good for me, this is bad for me.
Welcome to the Dealing with Feelings web series. Today, I had the distinct pleasure of interviewing a colleague of mine at the Yale Child Study Center named Eli Lebowitz. Professor Lebowitz is a world expert on childhood and adolescent anxiety, and he directs the program for anxiety disorders at the Child Study Center. We talked all things around familial influences and cross-generational influences on anxiety, and importantly, what we can do to support children in better dealing with their anxiety. I loved our conversation, and I know you will too. Please share your comments about the episode, and also subscribe to our channel so that you can learn more about how to deal with your feelings. Welcome, Eli.
Thank you very much. Great to be here.
Yeah, I'm very excited. Just so everybody knows, Eli and I are colleagues. We're both professors at Yale in the Child Study Center. And Eli, maybe you can just give people a quick kind of your lab and just set the context.
Sure. Together with Wendy Silverman, we run a program within the Child Study Center called the Anxiety and Mood Disorders Program. And that's really our focus, everything to do with child anxiety disorders, related problems, whether it's the etiology and causes, whether it's treatment, developing, testing treatments, whether it is some of the neurobiology, the brain research, the impact, just everything around child anxiety problems.
And my hunch is that you're busy.
That I'm busy? Who's not busy? We're all busy.
I'm joking. I'm meaning just because, I'm going to start off with a provocative question because it's been on my mind for the last couple of years. As you know well, the clinical psychology has been around forever, but the work on well-being, my work on emotional intelligence, positive psychology, mindfulness, all these treatments and strategies and techniques to support people to have greater well-being, have been very popular now. I mean, think about the happiness books that have been written. About 35 years, I'd say it's been front and center. And at the same time, as you probably know better than I, the data on anxiety and depression, continuously go up.
Yeah.
And so I'm curious, what are your thoughts about how treatments and programs and books, and as those go up, so do, our challenges. Any thoughts about that?
Yeah, it is kind of mind-boggling, right? There's more energy and effort and thought and work put into trying to stay well, probably than at any time in human history.
Mm-hmm.
And yet it is also true that so many people, so many children, so many families really are struggling. When it comes to anxiety in particular, I do think you get a little bit of a mix between people's awareness of mental health problems, willingness to talk about it, certainly among younger people. I'll tell you something. When I started treating anxious children, it was always the case that a parent would be concerned about their child and would somehow contact a doctor, right? Try to reach out, get some help. Today, that's not always the case. That's still really common, but it is not always the case. You get more of, my kid says they need help, right? My kid says they're depressed or they're anxious. And so there's certainly a lot more awareness among younger people. And, maybe that's like a little bit of a cultural change. It's also a little bit of access to information.
Mm-hmm.
When we were kids, if you were struggling with something, I mean, I guess you could talk to somebody or you could go to your public library, but
Right.
that's a really hard way to find information. Whereas typing into a search box or a chat box, why do I feel this way? What's going on? What's wrong with me?
Mm-hmm.
Leads you to information a whole lot quicker. But it's also true that we're just living in a world that is changing so rapidly. I don't think any of us really understand the impact of the changes that we're living through. I mean, even just in our lifetimes and even just in the last little bit of
Mm-hmm.
our lifetimes, things like the world's a different place. And that's probably in many ways for the better. And in some ways, it may also not be for the better and, may contribute to a certain extent to angst, unhappiness, stress, struggles of different kinds. So I don't have the answer
Yeah.
to your question, but you asked for thoughts.
Well, it makes me think about I was doing a presentation in California a couple months ago with some teenagers who had done their own research at their own school.
Mm,
And they talked about the sources of stress and anxiety, climate change, political division, uncertainty around the future, post COVID, social media. None of those things, I didn't worry about those things when I was 15 years old.
yeah, me neither. But now you made me anxious too.
Yeah. And so you're right. I mean, I do think it's different.
Hmm.
I wonder what your thoughts are around kind of the over identification with these, disorders, emotions. Like, do you find that some people, I mean, this is going to sound weird and probably I'll be ridiculed for it, but that like they think they're anxious, but they're not really anxious. They're kind of a little worried or a little concerned. You know, I'm curious how you help people get more granular about their experiences. You know how kids these days will say things like, I'm depressed. And I'm like, depressed? Like, I used to work at Bellevue Hospital. Let me show you what depression looks like.
Mm.
So, any thoughts about the prevalence is so high, but do you think there might be a percentage of that prevalence that's kind of mislabeled?
Well, I think the first thing I'd say, it's not maybe a direct answer to your question,
That's
but
okay.
the first thing I'd say is that as worried as you might be about over identification of mental health problems, I'm still a lot more worried about under identification
Uh-huh.
of health problems than I am about over. I think it's still a drop in the bucket compared to the so many people, so many children who actually, really, genuinely are struggling
Mm-hmm.
with serious mental health problems and with serious life stressors
Mm-hmm.
that are not getting any kind of help, that are not getting any kind of clinical attention. It's still the fact that for most kids in the world and for most kids in the United States, the time to any kind of mental health care from the onset of very real symptoms is still measured in months and
Yeah.
in years rather than the opposite. And so I'm not negating the idea that there can be a rush to pathologize
Mm-hmm.
in some cases for various reasons, whether that's fads or whether it's other kinds of benefits that can accrue or whether it's something else. I'm not negating the fact that there can be an issue there, but I think sometimes over focusing on that
Yeah.
sort of masks the fact that there are still so many kids who really are struggling and are truly not getting the help that they really, really need.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And that makes, I mean, total sense, especially even among adults, right? Males in particular with depression, you're not going to be reporting it. I'm using this example. I was talking with a parenting expert the other day, and we were talking about kind of the familial contagion effect. That because people are talking about it so much, that it becomes like a self fulfilling prophecy almost. But I think that's a very different. firstly, families that are having those conversations are very different than probably the families where you're referring to,
True.
that are not, they're ignoring it, or, whatever else might be happening.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. There's a small sliver of the population that is maybe overtreated or, over concerned. There is also, to a certain extent, maybe, changing tides or winds in how in our expectations and in what we think. Maybe that gets a little bit more close to the point that you were raising, meaning there's an old Hasidic story, if you'll if you
Sure.
permit it on the podcast,
Yeah,
but
of course.
there's an old Hasidic story about the guy who goes to the Rebbe, right, like the sage, and he starts laying out all his problems, right? Like, my wife is annoying and my kids are misbehaved and my boss is a jerk and my house is too small and like all of these things, and like lays out these 30 problems. And finally the Rebbe tells him, I can't help you with any of that. And he says, then what good are you? And he says, well, but I'll help you with problem 31. He's like, what? Another problem? He's like, yeah, problem 31. You think you shouldn't have any problems.
Uh-huh.
Right. So the point obviously being, if your expectation is constant serenity, then sure, you may view the transient difficulties, challenges, even crises sometimes of life as sign of illness,
Hmm.
disease, pathology that must be treated and must be removed. And as a parent, if you see in your child the experience of a negative emotion as something that never should occur,
Right.
then you may also view that as the sign that something's seriously wrong and we got to treat it. But if you kind of approach life with a somewhat more realistic outlook, then maybe it does prepare you a little bit better for coping with some of the challenges that really do make up an inevitable part of our life.
You just remind me of actually something related to your joke, which is about, I'm going to say 10 years ago, I gave this speech to a very a Hasidic community in New York.
Mm.
And the rabbi gave this amazing, like, keynote on the lunch break. He was just amazing. And I can't remember the details of his, because um, he did it in Hebrew, um, but I got it partially translated. And essentially what he said, and this part he did in English, what I loved, he goes, Mark, it's very interesting. In ancient Jewish philosophy, we have the blah 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 blah, which is the cognitive aspects of our lives, and we've got the blah 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 blah, which is the emotional aspects of our lives, and we've been talking for centuries about how those things work together to create humanity. And I just want to congratulate Yale University for publicizing everything that we already knew. Like, it was quite funny, and it was really, I wish I had recorded it. Anyhow, so going back to kind of this conversation around anxiety, you've been working in the field for a long period of time, and maybe we can just start off with, like, how did Ellie become an anxiety specialist? Like, what brought you to the place of studying anxiety?
Wow. Well, that is a while, but the truth of the matter is, this is a very long-standing interest for me. Mental health and psychology in general, a
Mhm.
very very long-standing interest. In my house, I have a book that my older sister gave to me for my birthday, and I must have been turning, I don't know, 13, 14 years old. I'm not sure of the exact date. And it's a book of like case studies in neurology, actually a great book by Oliver Sacks. And
Mhm.
she wrote in it, this is like to hold you until the real thing.
Wow.
And so she knew already. My sister already knew then what my interest was. So it's not a new passion for me. And I've been very interested in the area of anxiety and also of obsessive compulsive
Mm-hmm.
disorder for a really long time. So when I was an undergraduate student, I sought out some like volunteer experiences working in an anxiety and OCD clinic, and I would, go meet with patients, do some exposures with
Mm-hmm.
them, things like that, and that just continued on through some really amazing early mentors that I had, until I was really very fortunate to get the opportunity to come here through the generosity of a tremendously wonderful person who kind of established the Fund for the Anxiety program,
Mm-hmm.
and things kind of went from there.
Cool. So if I were to ask you a provocative question, um, what would you say your personal relationship is with anxiety?
Intimate.
Can you go a little more on that?
Well, I mean, I think first of all, we're all pretty intimately related
Uh-huh.
or familiar with anxiety. I certainly had a good dose of anxiety as well as some obsessive compulsive symptoms,
Mm-hmm.
actually, as a child. Nothing that was diagnosed or treated, and fortunately, not something that was an impediment to the basic functioning in life. In other words, did it affect my life? Definitely, right? You
Mm-hmm.
think about your social functioning, you think about your like how you are in different contexts, for sure. But I'm fortunate in the sense that it wasn't something that was a true obstacle or barrier to be able to
Mm-hmm.
develop and function. But um, certainly something that I'm very familiar with, and also have had my my fair share of like more specific fears and worries over
Mm-hmm.
time. I married a woman that we worked out a good division of labor. All the things that I worry about, she doesn't seem to worry about too much. And all the things that she worries about, I'm pretty laid back about. And so we end up with this wonderful division of labor for who worries about what. But between the two of us, we pretty much got it covered.
That's funny. So let's jump into just your work specifically. And so you primarily work with kids and families, because
Mhm.
my hunch is that treating the child without working with the family probably doesn't have the same impact.
I yes, I think that's fair to say, and certainly work with parents is a very big focus of what I do.
And so let's just define the concept, if you don't mind, because people, I don't think really understand anxiety. I mean, everyone I've spoken to has a different take on it, and I'm curious from your like, if you were to define, anxiety, where would you go with it?
There's, I guess, many different ways. Yeah, you will get a lot of different answers from a lot of different people, but I mean, at a very basic level, anxiety is a great gift to humanity. It serves incredible purposes. All organisms, not just human beings, not just primates, not just mammals, but like really all organisms have some capacity for identifying this is good for me, this is bad for me, right?
Mm-hmm.
This is the thing to approach, this is the thing not to approach. Human beings, either uniquely or in a very small group, developed this incredible innovation, or evolved, I suppose, this incredible innovation. And that is the ability to run simulations
Mm-hmm.
in our mind, right? We're not limited to, I need to be facing this fear or this thing in order to determine should I approach it or should I avoid it. I can run the simulation in my mind, like virtual reality, and
Mm-hmm.
consider in advance, is that going to be good for me? Is that going to be bad for me? Now, that's incredible
Mm-hmm.
because if you can run that simulation, you can avoid a lot of things preemptively, right? You
Mm-hmm.
can say to yourself, that's not going to be a good idea. I probably shouldn't do that. And you don't need to learn it only by direct experience, like, you get burnt, now you avoid it. You could think about it in advance. But at the same moment that we open the door to running these virtual reality simulations in our mind, we also open the door to a lot of self torment,
Mm-hmm.
to the ability to just chronically churn away at all of these different possible scenarios. And what we're not always very good at is figuring out which are the right ones to focus on, which are the ones that are things we can actually do anything about, which are the ones that are really most likely to actually affect us in life, how bad are things if they actually happen. And so we give a lot of them equal weight, even when really realistically that doesn't make a lot of sense. And so you end up with an incredible gift and ability, but also a huge vulnerability. And so when I
Mm-hmm.
think about anxiety, that's not a very technical description of anxiety, but in a sense, that's what we're doing, right? Like, we're opening ourselves up to imagining a lot of potentially negative scenarios and worrying about them, even in those times when it's not particularly helpful. And then you add on to that the fact that the things that we consider bad for us are a lot more sophisticated and a lot more varied than they might be for one of those simpler organisms, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
that for me is not just, is it going to make me sick? Is it going to kill me? Is it going to leave me out in the cold? But it's also, am I going to embarrass myself?
Mm-hmm.
What is somebody else going to think about me? Is it going to be psychologically unpleasant for me? And so the variety of potential negatives is tremendous,
Mm-hmm.
and my ability to focus on them is endless. And you end up with the potential for a lot of suffering.
Yeah, gosh, I'm just processing all that, and it makes I really appreciate the way you defined it, and because it's very clear in terms of how our brains operate around the way we perceive things and the uncertainty of things. And I think also, at least I know from my own anxiety, is that chatter or that rumination that happens sometimes. You know, it's like I have a go-to phrase, by the way, sometimes. I'm
Mhm.
like, "Mark, you're making this up. You
Mm.
are making up this is like no one's thinking this about you." And my hunch is that that's a little bit of the techniques you're helping people to discern all that stuff. So now let's go into, a child comes to your clinic with their parent, they're engaging in this kind of thinking that's obviously probably impeding them from maybe having good friendships or doing well academically or whatever it might be. How does your treatment plan, where do you begin?
Well, it'd probably begin with some assessment, because we'd like to understand really
Yeah.
what are the priorities here, right? Like, the real life presentation of mental health problems tends to be way more complex than what a lot of like textbooks on mental health might lead you to believe, right? Like,
Hmm.
people aren't really divided into, like, I have this, I have that, this is this, it's the other thing. Really, things are very complex, and actually, as you well know, it is way more common for somebody to have more than one problem
Yeah.
than it is for them to have only one problem.
Right.
And so, some of what we want to do is figure out, what are your priorities? What's your motivation? What do you feel is holding you back the most? And what do you feel is holding your child back the most as well?
Hmm.
And then, having thought about that, let's try to make a plan for, what is it that we can do when we're focused on anxiety. There's information that I'd like a parent and a child to have, like understanding a little bit more about this system. What does it do to your body? What does it do to your thoughts, right? What does it do to your feelings? How is it affecting your behavior? Sometimes, for a parent, just understanding, why is my kid acting that way? That seems so stubborn or infuriating or bossy or irritating. Sometimes just understanding that can be such a relief to the family system.
Mm-hmm.
I use a lot of metaphors when I'm working with, well, anybody really, and certainly with families. There's one that I've been using recently um, that I've found is helpful for parents just to get a little bit of empathy, I think, for what their child's going through. And I have to thank my wife for this too, because she's a big fan of escape rooms. I don't know if you've ever done an escape room, but basic idea is like this fun activity to do in a group, right? Like you'll go, they'll tell you a story, like World War III is going to break out in an hour unless you solve all these puzzles, and you're locked in the room until you get the secret key. And she loves it, and so we do them a lot. By which I really mean that we all go to the escape room. She solves everything and sort of patronizingly lets us turn the key in the lock or stuff like that, because she's amazing at it and I am not. But it made me think, imagine if you went to an escape room with a group, but one person in your group didn't know that it's a game, that it's not real, right? Like they're really concrete in their thinking, and they heard World War III is going to break out in an hour, or you're locked in the room, you can't escape unless you solve all the puzzles. How would they behave, right? Like they would be incredibly annoying.
Mm-hmm.
Because they'd be so bossy, right? Like, why are you wasting time? Why are you goofing off? Come on, get serious. And it would ruin everybody's fun for sure.
Mm-hmm.
And at the same time, your behavior as the other person would be bewildering to them. Because how are you not taking it seriously?
Mm-hmm.
Like, what is wrong with you that you're goofing off? You're treating this as a joke? And everybody would walk out of that feeling really angry at each other. I think sometimes if you have a kid in your family and they have an anxiety disorder, they have a lot of anxiety, that might be a little bit about what's happening. They're going through, they're seeing something really different from what you're seeing, right? Like they're seeing such a fraught minefield to navigate. Everything could go wrong. All the things that could be so catastrophically bad unless we do this just right. And so they end up driving everybody batty. And then they look at you and they think, why are you not being like this, right? Like, what's wrong with you? And so what I was saying is some information I think it's useful for the whole family to hear.
Sure.
And then there's also things that we would do differently, like what the work that I'll do directly with a child. It's going to be primarily focused on getting them really good at noticing, like, what are the thoughts that really do make sense, and they can kind of identify as like, yeah, that's like a really rational thought that I have. What are some of the thoughts that might be driven a little bit more by your anxiety, where it might be kind of maybe tricking you a little bit, pushing you around a little bit, maybe taking things to an extreme that doesn't really make sense, and doing some practice of, how can I resist that? What are some things that I can be brave about and do and push myself, even though they do feel scary, but they're not really dangerous? They're
Mm-hmm.
just scary. Making that differentiation between scary and dangerous can be really helpful. And practicing doing some of those things, that's a lot of what kids are going to be doing in treatment, gaining some skills to calm my body, to calm my thoughts, and standing up to those fears. And my work with parents is going to focus much more on their side of it. Like, how am I responding to my kid? What am I
Mm-hmm.
showing them? How am I potentially getting sucked into some of this vortex of life, not surrounding life, kind of being driven by the anxiety? How much is that changing the ways that I'm acting, and maybe trying to change some of those things? And if you do all of that, there's a really good chance that this kid can actually get a lot better, because as common and as impairing and really devastating sometimes anxiety can be, the world is also full of kids who used to have an anxiety disorder.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like, it is something that really can get a lot better with some concerted effort.
Yeah, lots in there. Thank you. I'm also thinking about, because I grew up I had tremendous anxiety as a child. I had unfortunately abuse in my childhood and a lot of bullying, and so just a lot of fear going to school, getting on the bus, getting home from school. And my father was like a tough guy from New York City.
Mm.
And so it was unrelatable to him. Like how could my son feel fear or anxiety when like you just beat him up, you know, and his mantra to me was, son, you got to toughen up. And, as you can see, didn't work so well. But I learned other strategies from other people. But I can imagine, when you're working with families, how that dynamic can play out. The mindset around anxiety or the just the temperamental differences, personality differences, really can. That's part of the model in terms of working with families.
Yeah, it definitely can. It definitely can play out. There are some parental stances that I think of as traps because they're so easy to fall into. They're so
Mhm.
natural to gravitate toward, but they end up being counterproductive. And two of them, I think, that really stand out in particular. One of them is kind of what you were getting at with your dad. Maybe it's what I would think of as a very demanding stance.
Mhm.
Like, there can be good motivation behind it, right? Like you talk to that parent and they'll tell you, I just want the best for my kid. I don't want them to be weak.
Right.
It's a tough world out there. And they have to be able to deal with it and they have to be independent. I'm not trying to raise a loser, right? I'm trying to raise somebody who can be strong and face the challenges. So they have, good intentions, but they end up being very demanding because what they're communicating to their child is either, I don't believe this is real, I don't think you are anxious,
Mhm.
or it's not okay that you feel this way. It's bad, it's shameful, it's wrong that you feel this way. And for a child who is anxious, having a dad who denies the possibility of being anxious, it doesn't help them to be less anxious.
Yeah.
If your dad is Superman and can fly, that's not a good reason for you to jump off a roof, right? Like you're still plummeting to the ground and you feel that way. You might admire that dad. You might think, "Wow, he's so strong. I wish I could be like him, but I'm not."
Mhm.
And I know I'm not. And so it doesn't really give you a bridge to overcome where you are. And then the other trap that I think is at least as common and also comes from really good intentions is what I would think of as a more protective stance, right? Like, I don't want my kid to suffer.
Mhm.
This is harmful to them. It's bad for them, or it's just painful for them. And I don't want them to feel that way. And so I make it my job to make sure they don't need to. I make it my job to make sure they don't have to be anxious. But the thing is, you can't, right? There's no way
Exactly.
to do that. And what you're really communicating to your child is you're really weak.
Right.
You can't handle things. I see that about you. You're so vulnerable. And the thing with anxiety is that the biggest driver of the actual impairment in anxiety problems isn't actually, are you more anxious or less anxious than somebody else? What really drives the impairment is, are you able to be anxious some of the time? Is that something you could tolerate for a
Mhm.
while? If you go through life thinking it is intolerable for me to ever be anxious, well, you're going to have a very impaired,
Yeah.
limited existence, right? And so I think they're both like really relatable, really understandable parental stances, but they end up being traps.
Yeah. That really makes total sense. There's a lot of. I just did this workshop for families in California who went through, the fires and supporting them. And I
Mm.
was doing this with a colleague of mine who's a developmental psychologist. And, we looked at the literature on resilience and also the work by Tom Boyce and others on, kids who are more biologically sensitive to their environments versus, the orchids and the dandelions.
Mhm.
And I'm wondering, does that play a role in the way you support kids?
The differences between them and their,
Yeah, kind of like I make a joke, and maybe this is not so funny, but anyway, I have a fifth degree black belt in the martial arts. I've got a PhD in psychology. You know, I, you know, I'm, I would say moderately successful, but I still have a very high startle reflex.
Hmm.
Like I just prone to like be activated, and I'm a deeply feeling kid, as some people call it. And other people that I know, just don't have the same reflex or the same kind of sensitivity. And so I wonder how much treatment has to be tailored to temperament or biology that way.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, obviously, kids really are. We're just different, right? Like people are different from each other. You know, in a sense, the basic task of every organism and of human beings is regulation, right?
Hmm.
We're regulators. We're doing that all the time, right? Like an air conditioner is regulating the temperature in a room, right?
Hmm.
You detect a change, it got too hot, it got too cold, you turn on to try to bring that back to stasis, right? To try to bring it back to the desired temperature. You get hungry, you eat something, you get cold, you put on a sweater. And we're doing that for external things, like it's cold, but we're also doing it for internal things, right? Something shifted how I feel right now, made me feel too scared, too worried, some other feeling. We're trying to bring ourselves back to baseline. But like anybody who has had an air conditioner, you know that they vary quite a bit. And the two things they vary on a lot are one, how sensitive are they? Meaning, how big of a shift in the room is actually required before this thing is going to kick in?
Hmm.
And how efficient are they? How good are they at bringing it back to the temperature you want after it's turned on? Now, I think like having a lot of anxiety, it's a little bit like being an air conditioner that is, on the one hand, very sensitive because it will react even to smaller changes. On
Hmm.
the other hand, it's not all that efficient, meaning it takes it longer and requires more work and more time to get back to the baseline once it has turned on. Well, if that's your air conditioner, it's going to run a lot of the time, right? It's
Hmm.
going to be on a lot. And so I think some of what you're describing, like my startled reflex, what sets me off? Does this bother me? Does that bother me? Just like, you put on a pair of socks and one person feels the seam for a second and then never feels it again for the rest of the
Hmm.
day. But somebody else is feeling it all the time and it's kind of bugging them and it's hard to tune out. And so those differences really do matter, right? And they are going to affect how are we trying to approach this treatment? What is it that I'm trying to get like better at? What are the skills that I need in order to maybe learn to ignore some of the small differences in temperature in the room, not turn on for every little thing? And what are the skills that I can learn to help me bring that back just a little bit more easily, right? So
Hmm.
I don't have to run for an hour every time the temperature shifts by 1 degree.
Yeah, thank you for that. I'm also wondering now about the there clearly in your work you're talking about managing kind of one's body with through breath work and through calming the nervous system down. You talked a lot about cognitive strategies. You know, maybe I'm sure you do work on like managing self-talk or
Mhm,
reframing
mhm.
techniques. What other techniques and strategies do you find are helpful besides those two?
I think every therapist, every clinician, they have some bag of tricks,
Uh-huh.
right? Like, what do I reach for? What do I teach people? In the end, that bag isn't as deep as we might like, right? Like a
Uh-huh.
lot of these are variations
Yeah.
on a theme, but you find what works best. What do you connect to? And also, what does this particular client, this particular patient seem to connect to the
Yeah.
best? So for one person, relaxation is a really great skill. And they can do breathing and they can relax. But then you'll also have lots of kids where telling them breathe deeply and relax just makes them irritated and annoyed,
Mhm.
right? It's like, I don't know, if your kid didn't come home from school and you were like really worried, and where are they? And you've called all their friends, nobody's seen them, and the bus driver says, I don't know. If I came up to you and said, take a deep breath,
Right.
breathe really slow, like you exactly, you're gonna punch me in the face. That's like incredibly irritating. And so for that kid, maybe something else is going to make more sense, right? Like even if it's a body skill, maybe they actually want to tense up their body because that's where the direction is flowing, right? Like that's what their
Hmm.
body's yelling at them to do, and they might actually find that a more useful, a more useful skill. Some people really connect with mindfulness, with like learning to like a little bit of a meditative state. Try to refocus your attention. Try to like be less judgmental of your thoughts and acknowledge the sensory experiences you're
Hmm.
having. Other people want more of a combative approach to the anxiety. I'm going to challenge these thoughts. I'm going to show why they're wrong. I'm going to argue with them and come up with like replacements.
Hmm.
People really are able to use distraction in a successful way, or to use their bodies another way. Like another good way to use your body when you don't want to relax, maybe you dance for 3 minutes, maybe you
Hmm.
go for a run and you raise your energy, but in a way that's not necessarily anxiety provoking, but does create a real shift in your internal experience. So I think a lot of these tools end up being variations on a few themes, but finding the right variation for this
Hmm.
particular person is, I think that's half the trick sometimes.
So what I'm hearing though is that ideally, like in my work, which is in education, we'd want we know these buckets. Like there
Mhm.
are buckets of strategies, whether it's breathing, mindfulness, movement, cognitive strategies, maybe some social support strategies, talking it through with people, etc. And it's really hard to be prescriptive with these things because it irritates people. Like, just think positively, Mark. It's like, I'll give you positive, or or whatever it is. Take the deep breath. I get yelled at in my office when I say, "Let's just take a deep breath." Anyhow, uh, but having a wide range of strategies, as a parent supporting a kid, as a kid supporting themselves, and then maybe it's kind of like trial and error. You just
Right.
and
It's a buffet. It's not a fixed meal. If this strategy isn't working for you, that shouldn't make you a bad patient. Right? Like
yeah.
you're not failing therapy because the particular strategy that your therapist thought would be helpful to you
Hmm.
wasn't. Right? Like that doesn't really make sense, and it assumes that everybody's exactly the same, and they're not. And so I think trial and error is right. It's more of a buffet. You put out different things, you try them, give them a fair shot. Right? Don't just write them off.
Right.
Give it a fair shot. But if it's not for you, it's not for you. Right?
Mhm.
That's okay.
I make the equation to like lifting weights. Like I tried CrossFit, it wasn't for me. It's just, it's just the whole thing didn't work for me. But other forms of exercise are fabulous. So I think the
So I
same.
hear. I wouldn't know. So I hear. So
But I think it's it's like music in many ways.
Mhm.
People choose the music that makes. That's what we say when we talk about music as an emotion regulation strategy. It's not any music. It's the music that you choose that helps you feel, more calm or whatever.
Yeah, I remember when my mother once got this CD. It was a while ago, I guess, but it got this CD of like whale noises, and it was supposed to be really calming. And I guess she thought it was. I have to tell you, within a few days, I wanted to break the thing.
Uh-huh.
To me, it was just irritating. But like that's the point, right? Like we're different. Your music isn't necessarily my music,
Yeah.
and like we're allowed to be different.
Can you just help us go from clinical to non-clinical in terms of how much of the work that you do do you feel has to be guided by a licensed or clinical psychologist versus teaching parents or educators these techniques and they can apply them with children? Is there a point, in the pendulum in terms of how deep the anxiety is, or
I think this is most relevant, really, to my work, more so with parents than it is to kids. Although, of course, you can teach. I think educating kids about mental health is really, really important. We nationally do not do a good enough job of that.
Working
I
on
mean,
it.
definitely not. It boggles the mind the way everybody assumes that physical education is a basic part of every school's curriculum, at least in grade school, and yet anything that you could put under the bucket of mental education. I mean, you know this so much better than I do with your like really deep expertise in school-based work, but it is still largely viewed as an add-on, a maybe, a
Hmm.
plus, a nice perk, something to do for a year. Maybe we do it, then we don't do it. Like it's not really viewed as a basic part of what does it mean to educate a child uh,
Correct.
in the way that PE is. But I think my own personal contributions in terms of what is more novel that I might be saying that another person might be doing differently is probably more when it comes to the work with parents. And I do think that a lot of that is broadly applicable, even if you are not necessarily the parent of a child with a clinical anxiety
Hmm.
disorder. If you are trying to help a child with a clinical anxiety disorder to overcome that problem, then yes, that should probably make most sense to happen within the context of some clinical setting, and you should probably be licensed to be providing that kind of mental health care. However, you don't need to be the parent of a child with a clinical anxiety disorder in order to think about what is my role in terms of raising this child and helping them to maybe not have an anxiety disorder,
Hmm.
in order to think about what am I trying to do here, what would be a better posture than a protective trap or a demanding trap. How can I approach those endless, million and one small daily interactions that I have, right? Like, the first time your kid comes into the room and says, I think there's a monster under my bed, you don't need to give them Prozac. You
Hmm.
don't to take them to the doctor. But is it an opportunity to think, what is the lesson that I'm teaching in the way that I'm responding? I'd say, yeah, it is. And so is the next day and the next day. And so there's a lot that I think educators, coaches, counselors, teachers,
Hmm.
gym, music instructor, I mean, anybody basically who's interacting with kids or with parents could probably be delivering that would be of tremendous value.
And so, as we kind of wrap up our time together, what are the three your top recommendations for families, for parent, when you're working with parents to help them raise an emotionally healthy child? Um,
Wow. Well, first of all, I do want to say I think there are a great many ways to be a wonderful parent.
yeah,
I know that there's always the I cracked the code for this is how we should parent kids, and
yeah,
this is how we should parent kids. And there's, you know, every day there's a new supply of new parents who want the answer to the code for how should we raise kids. I'm actually not really in that game. I'm not like, I don't think that I know the right way to parent
of
kids.
course.
But when it comes to anxiety, I think a good North Star for parents for a lot of situations is what I call a supportive stance.
Hmm.
And what I mean by that, because even that word, lots of people are going to hear lots of different ways and they'll say, well, I am supportive. And maybe they are. Maybe not in the way that I mean, but sure, you might be. What I mean when I'm talking about a supportive response or a supportive stance, what I mean is finding a way to respond to your child, especially in moments of difficulty, by showing them two critical messages. One is, first of all, some validation for what they're experiencing, just accepting that this is their experience in this moment and that it's a legitimate one. Maybe it's not one that you share. Maybe it's not even one that you want them to have. Maybe you think it's irrational, but that doesn't change the fact that this is their experience in this moment.
Hmm.
Right? Years ago I was hiking and I came across this family. They were doing what's it called, like rappelling. I don't love heights personally, so like I don't do a lot of rappelling, but they were doing it. And there's this kid, and he's strapped into the harness that you use. And then you have to like walk backward off a cliff, basically, which is why I don't do it. And then you like, walk your way down the mountain. This is supposed to be fun. Anyway, this kid is strapped into the harness and he's frozen in fear. He's just terrified. There are tears streaming down his face. And I went over closer to get like a little bit of a better look at what is going on here. And then I discovered that dangling like 10 feet below is his dad. And he's calling out, but it's fun.
Uh-huh.
This kid in this moment was not having fun.
Yeah.
Like, hey, get him to do it. Maybe he'll get to the bottom and say, cool, I want to go again. It's possible. But in this moment, he wasn't having fun. So what I'm saying is the first part of the supportive message is just to accept that this is what your child feels right now. But then to combine that with a message of confidence, not even confidence about what you're going to do. It's not like, I know you're going to step up. I know you're going to do the rappelling or raise your hand in class or pet the dog. Not even that. Just confidence that I know you can be okay despite feeling some distress, despite being uncomfortable. I know that that's something you're able to get through and to survive it and be okay. You're holding up like a reflection to your child of themselves as somebody who is understood, but as somebody who is also strong, who is capable, right? You're a parent, you're like a mirror. Your kid is looking into that mirror all the time and they're seeing, who am I? And if what they see reflected is somebody who can handle things, who can get through some difficult moments, even when they weren't sure they could, but you knew that they weren't quite as weak as they thought, that affects how they feel and how they approach the next challenge. So I would say, I think that's like my number one North Star is like, be accepting, show that confidence. I think that's a good guide for getting through endless interactions with your kids.
So I get the first one. Let's go back to the scene.
Okay.
The kid is on the rocks with his harness on. He's freaking out. And so instead of saying, it's fun, right? The parent might say something that would be more along, honey, I know it might seem scary. I understand that you're feeling a little nervous right now. That would be the validation piece. How does the confidence piece show up there?
I'm just saying, I know you can handle that feeling. Now, maybe this kid is going to choose to rappel today or maybe not.
Yeah.
Right? Like, the world doesn't stop if your kid doesn't do rappelling one day. That's like not the end of the world. But you're saying to them, I'm sure that you can handle that feeling. And when it comes into play the most around anxiety is when your kid is actually looking to you to change what you're doing because they don't want to feel anxious, right? Like your kid is shy, they're socially anxious, and so they want you to talk for them. Your kid is like scared to be alone. They want you to sleep next to them at night or never go out together in the evening. Or they're just worried about the news or their health or their grades, and they want you to reassure them that everything's going to be okay. It gives you an opportunity to say, like, I get it. It is a real worry. And also, I'm sure that you can handle that. And then I don't need to demand of them to do any of those things, but I can make some choices about what are the things that I'm doing. Because if I'm so sure that you can't be all right despite being worried some of the time, maybe I don't always step in to speak for you. Maybe I don't always provide that reassurance. And, it might be a little bit uncomfortable in that moment, it might even be more than a little bit uncomfortable in that moment. If you're building like brick by brick, you're building in this child the feeling that, yeah, there are challenges. And also, I can get through challenges. For a kid who's vulnerable to anxiety, that's life-changing. Because really, if you go through your whole life approaching things as things I can't handle, you're going to have a very different life than if you go through life with like, oh, if there's something, I need to avoid it. If there's a challenge, I can't handle it. You shared a lot about your own story. And, if what had crystallized for you as a child is I can't handle anything, well, the successes that you've accrued, maybe they wouldn't have accrued to the same degree, but something did your own internal resilience, your own grit, or help that you got from people. But
Yeah.
something did kind of solidify there around, yeah, there's a lot of hard things in life, but sometimes I can manage them, right? And it gets you through and like to the place where you are.
Couldn't agree more. And truth is, that my, without going into my story too deeply, I had an uncle who was my feelings mentor, and
Mm,
he ended up writing the curriculum that became my whole life's work.
mm,
And exactly, when he you're speaking to exactly my experience, which was my mother was when I disclosed what I was going through, my mother had a breakdown pretty much, and my father also got angry and wanted to retaliate,
mm,
not to me but to the person who did the harm.
mm.
um, they forgot about me though. Like, it's like I'm the one who's suffering here. And my uncle, on the other hand, wasn't having a breakdown or telling me to toughen up, just was there saying, I get it, and we're going to get through this together.
Yeah.
And that was a journey that then helped me build that, those techniques and strategies. And so I'm also hearing that, on top of the confidence, it would be helpful if the parent knew kind of the basics of healthy regulation, because
Mm.
they can then plant a little of those strategies in there to support the kid, in the process.
That definitely sounds helpful to me. Yes, and let's face it. I mean, like parents are coping with their own challenges
Yeah.
at the same time. Parents don't have kids who are blank slates, and kids don't have parents who are blank slates either, right? Like the challenges that you're bringing as a child to the table, they're also bumping up and meeting, like years of difficulties sometimes, of their own anxiety, of their own
Hmm.
ability to regulate themselves. And so, that can be a tough cocktail. But if you, as a parent, if you are able to learn a little bit about what works for you, think about that, and understand a little bit about what's going on inside your kid's brain. You don't need to be a perfect parent in order to help your child through difficult things. When my first, I have three boys, and when my first one, a long time ago now, was just born, like literally the day he was born, I remember holding him and say, like, let's make a deal. I'm not going to be a perfect parent. You won't be a perfect kid. We'll get through it.
Hmm.
Because like you don't need to be a perfect parent. But yeah, I think if you can get a little bit of your own like self-regulation and understanding of some of those skills, it is going to be easier for you to offer some of that to your kid as well.
Thank you. So my last question for you is one that is like a little bit of a mindfulness reflection,
Uh,
um, because I'm always curious to hear what people think about a world in which parents and kids understand the concepts that you're teaching. So I'm going to ask you to imagine a world where kids get the emotion education, parents get the emotion education, people understand anxiety in a way that is not one that is debilitating, but one of like life is going to be filled with anxiety, and we're going to get through this together. We're going to learn about it and manage it. What do you see different about today's society if that were the reality?
mm, well, that is a big question, and my mind is going in like a lot of different directions because you know on one hand, I think we would unleash a lot of untapped potential.
Hmm.
Frankly, there's a lot of like opportunity cost to the ways in which anxiety does hold people back, right? Like a lot of people would be doing a lot of wonderful things were it not for the role that anxiety plays in their life. And sure, anxiety also does drive some potential, right?
Yeah,
It doesn't only impede. We didn't evolve to have such a huge part of our brain devoted to anxiety only because it's bad, but
exactly.
that wouldn't make sense. But I do think that a tremendous amount of like opportunity cost could be leveraged or harnessed or whatever the word would be if not for the disrupting and impairing role that anxiety plays in so many people's lives. I also think that we might have a somewhat more pleasant place to live in, because it's not only about what do you accomplish and what do you achieve or your productivity levels. It's also, who are you as a human being? What's it like to be next to you? What's it like to interact with you? I think it's important to remember that the fight or flight response, half of that is fight.
Hmm.
Anxiety drives a lot of the more negative interactions that we have. Anxiety primes us for a lot of aggression, for a lot of violence. And so I could also imagine a rather more pleasant environment in which to live our lives.
Awesome. That was wonderful.
Isn't it?
Um, Thank you, Ellie. I really enjoyed the conversation. I hope this
Me
was,
too. Thank you so much for having me.
yeah.